Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about Sufism, Islamic mysticism, we often end up talking about the tariqas, the big spiritual orders. And if you've been listening for a while, you'll know names like the Shadhili, the Naqshbandi.
Sure, the Mevlevi dervishes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But if you look at just, well, the sheer scale of it all, the history, the global reach one name really does seem to rise above the rest.
The Qadiriyya.
The Qadiriyya is, it's just a phenomenal story in the history of religion. It's one of the oldest orders that's still going, and it all traces back to one man in the 12th century, a foundational figure named ʿAbd al-Qādir al-Jilani.
And that's where we're going today, a deep dive into the life of this globally famous scholar and saint. And our mission really is to get at this central puzzle. How did an order that was built around one man's teachings, an order that pretty much rejected any kind of central leadership or rigid rules, how did that become maybe the biggest mystical movement in the entire Islamic world? It's a great question, because we're looking at a figure who, well, he might not be as famous in the West as someone like Rumi, but across huge parts of the world, he's an absolute household name. He's seen as one of the greatest spiritual authorities, one of the Awliya in history. His journey is it's what defines the whole legacy.
So let's start at the beginning. Where's he from?
He was born in 1077 in a region called Jilani, which is in modern-day Iran.
Okay, so he's Persian.
Well, yes and no. His lineage, they say, traces back to Ali ibn Abi Talib, so it's an Arab lineage. But he almost certainly grew up speaking Persian, so he's already bridging these two massive cultural worlds.
And at some point, he decides to leave home.
He does. At 18, which is a crucial age, right? In 1095, he makes the journey to Baghdad.
Which was the center of everything.
The absolute center. The symbolic heart of the Islamic world, even then. But he doesn't show up with, a trust fund.
Right. Our sources say his early years there were incredibly difficult.
Oh, incredibly. He was this impoverished student, and there are stories of him facing actual starvation just to pursue his studies.
But his personal struggle was happening against this massive historical backdrop.
Exactly. You absolutely have to place him in his time. He gets to Baghdad right at the tail end of what historians call the Shiite century.
Meaning that for a long time, the dominant powers in the region, the Buwaids in Iraq, the Fatimids in Egypt, had been Shiite dynasties.
Right. And now the tide is turning, the Seljuks are in power, and there's this huge push for what you could call a Sunni revival.
So scholars are feeling this pressure to formalize their identity.
To define it, to formulate a really clear, unified Sunni identity in response to generations of Shi'i political and intellectual dominance.
And that's why we see the founding of these huge schools, these madrasas.
That's it exactly. Schools like the famous Nizamiya, where the great al-Ghazali had taught. These weren't just schools, they were like intellectual fortresses designed to systematize Sunni law and theology.
It's amazing to think about who was in that city at that time. Al-Jilani arrives, ready to study, just as al-Ghazali is having his famous spiritual crisis and walking away from it all.
The overlap is incredible, isn't it?
Huh.
And al-Jilani, well, he jumps right in. His main passion wasn't philosophy or theology, it was fiqh.
Islamic law, jurisprudence.
Yes, and specifically, he identified with the Hanbali school.
Which, even today, has a reputation for being the most strict, the most literalist of the four main schools.
It absolutely does. It's the school that, centuries later, would heavily influence the Wahhabi tradition. It's all about sticking to the text.
And he studied under a major Hanbali scholar, Abu Sa'id al-Muharrimi.
He did. And this is where the whole story pivots, because al-Muharrimi wasn't just his law professor, he also became his spiritual guide, his Sufi Shaykh.
Oh.
And after al-Muharrimi died, al-Jilani actually took over the school. He became the #1 Hanbali legal authority in all of Baghdad.
But at the same time, he's on this other path, a mystical one.
A deeply intense one. And this is the part that must have confused a lot of his contemporaries.
Oh, so?
Because while he's mastering the fine points of law, he's also being just completely overcome by these intense spiritual states, sometimes so much so that he couldn't even function.
What would he do?
He'd go out into the desert, he would retreat for long periods, and people would report finding him just screaming uncontrollably from the sheer intensity of his experience.
Wow. So much so that he got a nickname for it.
He did. He became known by some as Abdul Qadir al-Majnun.
A madman.
The madman. Imagine that. You're the top legal scholar in the city, but on the street, people are whispering about you being the madman.
That must have been an incredible weight to carry. He obviously needed help managing all of this.
He prayed for a guide, desperately. And besides al-Maharimi, another key teacher was a man named Hamad Adabas, who was known for his extreme methods.
Extreme how?
Well, there's a famous story of him pushing al-Jilānī into the freezing Tigris River in the middle of winter.
Just to test him.
To shatter his ego, his nafs. This was a very direct, very harsh kind of training designed to break down a person's pride and self-importance. It was part of this very old, very deep Baghdadi school of Sufism.
So let's connect the two threads here, because this is the core of it, isn't it? On one hand, you have the premier scholar of the strictest, most text-focused law school.
A Hanbali jurist.
Right. And on the other, you have this ecstatic mystic, this madman, this student of these intense Sufi masters. To a modern listener, that sounds like a total contradiction.
It does, and that's probably the most important historical misconception we need to clear up.
That Sufism and orthodoxy are separate things.
Exactly. That dichotomy is largely a modern invention. For most of Islamic history, Tasawwuf Sufism wasn't some fringe movement. It was considered the spiritual heart of the religion, the discipline of making your faith real and deep.
So being a Hanbali and a Sufi wasn't weird at all.
Not at all. In fact, other major figures, even controversial ones like al-Hawaj, were also Hanbalis. Al-Jilani is maybe the perfect example of this harmony between the law and the spirit.
Okay, so let's get into his teachings, his theology. You mentioned he was a traditionalist.
Yes, an Atharari. This grows directly out of his Hanbali legal training. He rejected what's known as kalam.
Speculative theology.
Right. Using Greek logic and rational arguments to try and understand God's nature. Al-Jilani saw that as a dangerous path. He thought it led people away from pure faith into, endless arguments and confusion.
And his alternative was this principle of bila kaifa.
Bila kaifa. Without how.
What does that mean, practically speaking?
It means you accept what the sacred texts say, literally, but you don't ask how. If the Quran says God has a hand, you accept it. You don't start speculating on what that hand is made of or how it works. You just submit. It's an act of profound trust over reason.
And this combination of legal authority and spiritual depth must have made him a powerhouse in Baghdad.
Unmatched. He was running his law school, the madrasa, but he also had a Sufi lodge, a ribat attached to it, where he guided his disciples, his murids.
He was a one-stop shop for the entire spiritual and legal path.
He was. And his status grew to be immense. This is where you get that famous, kind of provocative statement that's attributed to him.
And what about his feet?
These feet of mine are upon the necks of all the other awliya, all the other saints. It's not seen as arrogance, but as a statement of his unique spiritual station. He's the Goth, the Paul of Poles.
So if he's the ultimate authority, what's the path he's offering? What are the key practices of the Qadiriyya?
First and foremost, the guide is everything. The Shaykh. He has that famous line, the person who has no Shaykh has Shaitan as his Shaykh.
Satan is your guide if you don't have a human one.
Precisely. You need a living master to guide you. And in terms of practices, he approved of things like khalwa, or spiritual seclusion, usually for 40 days.
And the Dhikr, the remembrance of God.
Yes, and in the Qadiriyya, that tends to be a very powerful communal practice. It's often loud, rhythmic, intense, sometimes with frame drums. It's about generating a shared spiritual state.
But it seems like the real core of it, the day-to-day work, was about ethics, the mujahada.
The struggle against the ego. Yes, he laid out these 10 habits for the seeker, and they're incredibly practical.
Give us some examples.
Okay, so beyond the basics, he insisted on things like never swear an oath, ever. Don't lie, not even as a joke.
That's tough.
It's really tough. And here's another one. Never make a promise you're not absolutely sure you can keep. Think about how that would change your daily life.
It'd change everything. What else?
A huge one was not placing a burden on any other creature, to always serve others before yourself. And all of this leads to the single most important quality.
Which is?
Tawadu, humility, radical humility.
And how did he define that?
He taught that the seeker must always consider everyone else to be better than themselves, even a non-Muslim, even a known sinner.
How could that be?
Because you have to think, perhaps they will be guided and saved in the end, while I might stumble and fall. It's this constant state of self-awareness and self-critique. That, for him, was the perfection of God consciousness.
So al-Jilani dies in 1166. But he didn't actually, file the paperwork to start a formal Tariqa, did he?
He did not. The organization, the order as we know it, really came together after he died. It was his sons, especially Abdul and his students, who collected his works and structured the path.
So the order was built on his memory. his posthumous authority.
Entirely. This is when the hagiographies, the stories of his miracles or karāmāt really take off. They cement his status as the goth. The whole thing is built on his immense spiritual gravity.
And this is where we come back to that puzzle from the beginning. The key to the Qadiriyya's success is its lack of structure.
It's non-centralized structure. It's brilliant, really. Unlike other orders with a very specific method like the Mevlevi whirling or the Naqshbandi silent Dhikr, the Qadiriyya doesn't have a single mandatory practice or a pope-like figure.
Which means it's adaptable.
Infinitely adaptable. It allowed local branches to absorb local customs and, fit into different cultures without needing permission from some central office in Baghdad.
And the spread was just unbelievable.
Astonishing. By the 1400s, it's already in Spain, Turkey, India, even China.
Oh.
Today it's huge in West Africa, especially Senegal. It's all over the Balkans, Russia, everywhere.
Can you give us an example of that adaptation in action?
A great one is the greatest master himself, Ibn Arabi. He took his initiation, his spiritual connection, from one of al-Jīlānī's own students. So he's spiritually linked to the Qadiriyya.
And then you have something like the Chinese branch.
Right. In the 18th century, a Chinese Qadiri master named Qi Jinji actually integrated Neo-Confucian and Taoist ideas into the practice.
Wow.
You couldn't do that in a rigid, centralized order. It would be heresy. But here, it was just local flavor.
The political range is also pretty wild, isn't it?
Oh, completely. You have some branches in West Africa that the French colonial powers saw as cooperative, as apolitical.
And on the other extreme,
The great Algerian freedom fighter, Emir Abd al-Qadir, a Qadiri leader who led a decades-long military war against the French, and his legitimacy was based entirely on his spiritual authority in the order.
so it can be quietist or militant.
And the veneration itself can vary. In Morocco, you have groups like the Julala who use music therapy, and their reverence for al-Jilani is so intense that some outsiders have described it as bordering on worship.
Which is a long way from the strict Hanbali law he started with.
A very long way.
So if the practices are different, the politics are different, even the schools of law can be different. What's the one thing that holds it all together? What makes a Qadiri in Senegal and a Qadiri in Bosnia part of the same thing?
It's him. It's the man himself. The single unifying factor across the entire globe is the figure of al-Qādir al-Jilani as the supreme spiritual pole and the ultimate link in their chain back to the Prophet.
It's a legacy built on a person, not a rule book.
Perfectly put, it's built on spiritual rank, not institutional control.
So to wrap this up, we've seen al-Jilani's journey from a strict Hanbali jurist in this really critical moment of the Sunni revival in Baghdad.
All the way to becoming one of the most revered spiritual figures in Islamic history.
And his legacy, the Qadiriyya, is so remarkable because it's so diverse, because it isn't centralized.
It flourished because it put that deep personal spiritual guidance and that ethical core, that tawadu, that humility ahead of any kind of rigid bureaucratic system.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Just consider the power of a legacy like that. A global movement full of incredible diversity that's held together for 900 years based entirely on one person's spiritual authority. Given that incredible reach and that cultural fusion we've talked about, what does al-Jilānī's enduring status as the pole of poles tell you about the nature of saintly veneration in the Islamic world? Something to think about.